It may seem hard to believe, but this is the third YouTube module, which means that even though I'm making it before then, you are probably well on your way into the course. The major thing I'm concerned about is going to be that by now you ought to have a pretty good idea of who you're going to interview. And as I said, these interviews, if for some reason 2 or 3 of you are in the same place, you want to do the interviews that way, I don't have a problem. And I definitely don't have a problem if you do the projects as a team. But again, I just think we ought to stay, if possible, with no more than 3. I just don't see the balance, the evenness of the work, if we don't do it that way. But if it's a real serious problem, just let me know. Okay, we're now looking at Chapter 3, which is the actual purpose of the budget. And whether it's this week or next week, you're going to see a rather longer video, one we made here at Morgan, that talks with somebody who was director of a center, a branch of another university, a branch of the university located in a different place. And that's a rather interesting challenge because you have to simultaneously deal with the reality of where you are and yet recognize that, in her case, 40 miles away is the parent campus. And you have to work probably twice as hard, but I don't want to steal her thunder. She'll give you a great deal of information on that. One of the things that we sort of use as a rule of thumb to describe the purpose of a budget is simply it is a financial tool used to achieve a specific goal within the university or college. That works out very well. One of the challenges that's constantly being faced, and as I flow through this third chapter, we'll have a lot more to say about this, but the idea that the budget is a living document. It's almost like a living animal. It can be looked at nearly as often as you want. I remember when I started this a long, long time ago, you were lucky if you could look at your budget quarterly. Now, if you want to look at your budget in the morning and in the afternoon, the way these computer systems are set up, you could look at it every hour if you wanted to. That would be a little bit obsessive compulsive, but you could do it. And the main reason for doing that is to determine as the fiscal year evolves, do you want to reallocate funds, leave funds where they are, or if you're lucky, just let the thing flow because it's going well. That's what we're about. Okay, now, the real interesting challenge when it comes to managing a budget has to do, what do you do at the end of the fiscal year? We'll talk more in the structure of that process, but I'm more concerned about the function of it. Because every fund balance within an institution has, once the budget kicks off, usually July 1, but it can be, if it's federal, September 1. And if you're working off a grant program, it could be any time. But the point is, if there is a fund balance remaining at the end of that fiscal year, what happens? The majority of schools still allow you to retain a fund balance, which means that within Morgan State University, the College of Education and Institutional Development, we are allowed, if we don't spend all of the money that's allocated to us for, say, we're in fiscal 18 right now, we would be allowed to propose to the chief fiscal officer, I think is called the vice president for finance at Morgan, propose to him or her, I don't even know which one it is, what we would like to do with that budget. I've got a little bit more to say about that in just a minute. Other things can happen. You may have to turn it back into the college's general operating budget. And what happens then is that money gets reallocated. In systems, that's not as efficient because in systems where that occurs, you will see a flurry of spending within the last month of the fiscal year because you don't want to give any money back because, number one, you'll probably get the same thing you got last year because you didn't use it all in the appropriate fiscal year. You pushed it all to the end. So that's a real challenge to do that. The other thing that can happen, not often, but the other thing that can happen is the state could tell you what you're going to do with that money. If you've submitted to us, in this case Maryland, you have submitted to us a budget which we provide In Maryland, it can range anywhere from 30 to 50%, or none. We'll get into that in a minute too. But what can happen is they may say, all right, you submitted a budget to us of X dollars. Take the money you have, turn it into a percentage, and reduce your FY19 budget by that percentage and put the money back in. That is not very practical. That's when you give people spending, just to have the money spent so you don't get cut. So that's the other one. That can happen. It doesn't happen very often. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about who has authority there. The state always has authority. The question is, will it or will it not exercise that authority? If you've been in Maryland very long, you remember the name William Donald Schaefer, who was everything. He was mayor of Baltimore for nearly forever. And the rest of forever, he was did his 2 terms, 8 years as our governor. He was one more than willing to take the money back because he was a spendthrift of sorts. As often his money didn't make it through the year. So that was another issue. So you have kind of a pyramid. There will be people internally. We have a dean of the College of Education and Urban Studies. That's what it is, Education and Urban Studies. She's retiring June 30th. So by the time you see this video, she will be retired. She would have some say within the funds of the budget. Now, she could not do it exclusively on her own, but very often your chief fiscal officer goes along with the next step. So you'd have that kind of an allocation could take place. Or the chief fiscal officer could say, well, College of Education, you had a good year. You got a little bit more tuition than you thought you were going to get, more enrollment. Therefore, I will move that money to somewhere that did not have as good a year and they needed some help. So that would be about as high as it would go. Of course, usually, now I've not seen it happen since I've been at Morgan, but usually the president of the university can, because he gets a report at least every month of that budget flow. And he might say, well, the College of Engineering has the opportunity to put up some matching money for a big federal or state grant. We're going to tap each program. The last I heard about fiscal 19 at Morgan was that the entire university budget was $1 million in the red. Sounds like a lot of money, but it really isn't. So this summer, largely I guess in the month of June, the president and his senior administrators will be meeting to talk about that money and where is it going to go. Within the budget, move on to that, within the budget you have a variety of line items. You have your general operating budget, and that varies from fiscal year to fiscal year. That gets confusing, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, because you have a myriad of different fiscal years. You have a capital budget. Let me come to that later as well. Maryland has a very good, but it can be a very confusing fiscal year. Auxiliary budget, most of these are self-sustaining. Our program, the other program I teach in, Community College Leadership Development, must be self-sustaining. Primarily gets its money through a federal grant and then some supplemental federal grants. The greatest example of that within the Maryland system is University of Maryland University College. They must always be 100% self-sustaining. There's special federal funds. Some of you know about TRIO. Some of you know about Title III, developing institutions, Title V for Hispanic serving institutions, and so forth. Models, you have a formula budget that stays pretty constant year to year. They write up a formula, you submit your budget against that formula, you get your money, and you go on about your business. The incremental budget tends to be, they would tell you, Morgan's is sort of incremental because Dr. Wilson, at the start of building the budget, and we'll talk about that in a minute, told the people how to plan. He said everyone should hold their budget to a 2% increase. He took some of the money he expected to get because Morgan had not had a salary increase for a while, and he needed to do something about that, and that's how he did it. What else should we talk about? You have something called the Plan Program Evaluation Budget System, which is a constantly comparing the plan against a pre-established set of evaluative tools. That's not a bad budget system. I have worked under those, and they're not bad. Zero-based is a lie. You never have a complete zero-based budget, even in the private sector. So I'm going to want to talk more with you about that a little bit later. What we're told most of the time in our text, of course, is that you have a mixture of these. And as we get more time in classroom, we'll talk more about that. Chapter 5 is a development of certain things. How do you develop